Hey fellow carb fiends, today we're making fresh pasta dough. Why? Because it's really not that hard, even if you don't have a fancy schmancy pasta machine, and yet, if you're anything like me, fresh pasta often feels like it's one of those things that is somehow always too much. Be it too much work, too much time, too much effort, too much mess. So I decided that I wanted to make this video both to share my recipe with you and to remind myself how easy and straightforward the process actually is. Anyway, I'm going to show you my standard recipe, which I slightly adapted from the recipe we learned in culinary school. And then I'm going to show you how to make two shapes of long pasta with just a rolling pin and a knife, plus how to speed up the process using the pasta attachment of a stand mixer. I've always been really happy with how this recipe turns out, so I've never sought out other recipes, but I am interested to know, do you have a go-to recipe? Let me know in the comments if there's a particular one that you really like, and I'd love to check it out. So first, let's grab ingredients. You'll need a couple of eggs, oil, I usually use extra virgin olive oil, but you can use other oils too, salt, and of course flour. You can obviously splurge on specialty flours, but today I'm just using standard AP flour. Now, tools. So at minimum, you're going to need some kind of knife, ideally a nice and sharp chef's knife, a rolling pin, a little forky fork for mixing, and I like to use a medium to large mixing bowl. If you've got access to one, you can also grab your pasta roller, either a manual crank style or, like this one, an attachment which works with your stand mixer. These tools here will set you up for making long pasta shapes, from making your dough through to cutting your dough into the shape you want. There are tons of super fun specialty tools for making all sorts of pasta shapes, like this cavatelli board where you press and roll bits of dough across the grooved surface, but that is chatter for a different video. Oh, and one last recommendation, I always keep a bench scraper of some sort on hand when working with any type of dough, because it makes it really easy to neatly lift and shape the dough, especially if your dough is misbehaving in any way. So that's it, that's my tool spiel, now let's make the dough. I've already measured my flour into my bowl, and now I'm going to push the flour out from the center to make a little well. And yes, I'm using a bowl. You can do exactly what I'm about to show you using the volcano method, where you make a mound of flour directly on your countertop, but for the sake of tidiness, in my silly little kitchen, I'm gonna use a bowl. So let's add our salt, oil, and the eggs into our little well. Now grab your fork and start to break up and scramble the eggs. Pretend that your flour well is a bowl itself, and keep your fork movements within the perimeter of that well. You'll see some of the flour start to incorporate, maybe a lump will topple in. That's okay, that's part of the process. So now I'm changing from that scrambling motion to more of a round circular motion, and you notice how the wet egg is grabbing a little bit of the flour from the edges of the well? That's what you want. It's gradually incorporating a little bit of flour into the egg, slowly making the dough. So I just like to keep alternating from that stirring motion to more of the beating motion, to slowly incorporate flour, and then to more thoroughly incorporate the flour into the egg itself. If you're doing this on the counter, you want to be careful not to let the runny egg break through the wall of the well, or it'll run all over and be much messier and harder to incorporate smoothly. As you can see, it'll gradually become a thicker and thicker paste as you pull more flour into the egg. And eventually it's just a sticky blob and you can just start mashing everything together. When it becomes too difficult to mix with the fork, scrape the fork clean and start kneading with your hands. You can keep it in the bowl or turn everything out onto your work surface. Knead the dough until all the flour is incorporated. It doesn't have to be smooth, beautiful dough yet, but you shouldn't see any more pale, floury bits. So here's my dough. I'd give it a few more kneads to make sure those tiny little floury spots are well incorporated, but this rough texture that you see is actually okay. We're going to wrap it up in plastic to rest and let the flour fully hydrate, and after its little 30-minute rest, it's going to look like this one, which has already had its rest. The texture has smoothed, as you can see, and the glutens have relaxed, so it's much more pliable and ready to be rolled out and cut. Okay, so let's make the first shape. This is going to be a pappardelle, big, wide, flat noodle. It's fairly rustic by nature, so you don't have to agonize over how thick the dough is, but you do want it to be fairly thin, maybe 1/16 of an inch. But if it's a bit thicker, that's also okay. Dust your work surface with flour and cut a chunk of your dough, maybe a third of what you have. Wrap the remainder back up in plastic to keep it from drying out. Dust your little chunk of dough lightly with flour and pat into a little patty shape, and roll it out with your rolling pin, trying your best to create a somewhat rectangular shape that'll make it neater when we go to cut later. Make sure to lift up your dough and rotate it occasionally, both to make sure it's not sticking to your counter and to help you get a more even shape as you roll. If your dough is fighting back and resisting being rolled out, you might need to let the gluten relax. Just cover it with plastic to keep it from drying and let it rest maybe like 10 minutes. That should do the trick. So this is an okay thickness, but I know it's going to bulk up when it's boiled, so I'm going to try to get a bit thinner to account for that. Okay, so now that I'm happy with that thickness, it's just a little bit thinner than before. I'm going to dust both sides of the pasta with more flour so that it doesn't stick to itself, and then fold it gently into a neat packet. I'm using a sharp knife and cutting about 1/2 inch wide strips. And once you've done that, you just unfold each of the strands and ta-da! You've got a lovely little pile of pappardelle. Okay, the second shape that I want to show you I love. I think it's faster than pappardelle because you don't have to roll it as nicely, but it does take more time on the shaping step, so I don't know, maybe it all evens out. Anyway, this is called Strangozzi, which is a classic Umbrian pasta shape. The root of the name is the same word for shoelace because these noodles end up looking like shoelaces. If my research is correct, the dough would actually be more commonly made with either no eggs or fewer eggs because eggs are expensive. You can obviously hunt down those more traditional recipes, but I like to streamline things and just stick to my main base recipe for nearly all the shapes of pasta that I want to make. So we started pretty much the same way, just making a little patty, dusting with flour, and rolling it out with a rolling pin. I don't even have specific thickness in mind, I just like, I don't know, roughly 1/4 of an inch. We're gonna fold it again the same way we did before, so dust with flour, and now we're cutting little strips and unfold them, lace them out. And so here's what I do to make these. Take one of these little worms and roll it between your palms. Flip it, do the other half. And you can give it a little bit of a stretch if it's still too thick, and that's it. You can also roll it flat on the counter. I just don't like to. It's more comfortable for me to do it in the air, but it's totally your call. This is a very low stress, rustic shape. You pretty much can't mess it up. If it folds over on itself, that's okay. Just stretch it back out. If the strand breaks, that's okay. You'll just have a little short piece that's still delicious. You can skip the rolling step if you want and just leave them as is, as little skinny little rectangles, or just stretch them thinner without the roll. But I like the rounded edges and slightly twisty shape of rolling the noodles. I like how they look, how they chew, and the little twisty parts catch the sauce really nicely. So here are 2 hand-rolled and hand-cut shapes: rustic, bouncy Strangozzi and hearty pappardelle. Next, we're going to move on to our last shape, which is using the pasta attachment of my stand mixer. Okay, so this is the same dough. I've just smushed it into an oblong squarish shape, and now we just need it to be a little flatter in order to feed nicely into our pasta roller. I'm smushing and stretching by hand, but honestly, a rolling pin works better. I just didn't feel like bringing it over here. It's important not to let the surface of your dough get sticky as you feed it through the machine because stickiness causes tearing and it makes it an absolute pain to clean the roller later if it's got sticky, dried bits of dough in there. So start on the widest setting of your roller. For mine, that's a 1. Feed your dough through. I like to run it through twice on this setting because I feel like it helps with uniformity. And next, we're going to do a letter fold, bringing the short ends in towards the center, smush it back out or roll it out. Again, that's easier. And what this fold does is help us get 2 straight edges, which makes it much easier to neatly pass the sheets of pasta through the machine. My piece of dough started out fairly uniform, so I could technically have skipped this step, but if your dough sheet is more of an oval or blobby shape, this folding step will help you set yourself up nicely for the following steps. So I'm going to feed it through the same widest setting, and then flip it and run it through again, feeding the other end in first, just to even out the shape. Again, I like to do this twice, but you can do it once if your dough is just feeling fine and you're ready to move on. And that's it. We're done with the folds now, but the rest of the process is very much the same. Keep your dough sheet nicely dusted with flour, checking for stickiness before each pass. And now we're going to shrink down a size on the roller. So for me, that's going from setting 1 to 2. Feed it through the same way we have been, then repeat. Adjust down to the next smaller size, dust with flour if needed, and run it through 1 or 2 times. At some point, your dough will become a bit long and unwieldy. Just cut the sheet in half to make it easier to handle, and make sure you wrap the dough you're not working with in plastic to keep it from drying out while it waits. So this was setting 4 for me, and I'm okay with that thickness. You can totally go thinner, but I'm happy with this. If you're making a filled pasta like tortellini or ravioli, keep in mind that your thickness will be doubled in places. So the general rule that I was taught for those types of pasta, you should be able to see the outline of your hand through the dough if you hold it up to the light. So I've switched out my rolling attachment for the fettuccine cutting attachment. There's no thickness adjustment here. All we have to do is just feed our pasta sheets straight through. And as you can see, this cutter is a bit mid, so I've got to go back through and separate some of these strands by hand, but that's not a big deal. And here is our tangle of fettuccine. You're going to want to dust them with flour to prevent sticking, and if you're not using them right away, you might want to let them dry a little bit, either spread out flat on a floured baking sheet or hung on a pasta drying rack. I hope walking through those steps made fresh pasta feel a bit less daunting if you don't have a machine, or maybe it encouraged you to bust out those specialty pasta tools that might be gathering dust in your closet. Fresh pasta goes well with hearty ragouts, like a classic ragu bolognese, but I also love to dress it really simply, like a classic aglio e olio. It really lets the bouncy texture shine. I also love an easy, quick pesto. On that note, if you're looking for inspiration, keep an eye out for my next video where I'll be sharing 4 of my favorite quick, springy pestos, all of which can be made in less time than your pasta dough needs to rest. To be notified when that video is live, hit that little subscribe button and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching and happy cooking!